Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about this wonderful little book of poetry called Sounding the Seasons, 70 Sonnets for the Christian Year. This is written by Malcolm Guite, who I'm excited to tell you about if you've not heard about him. He is one of my favorite living contemporary poets. He's a British poet. He's actually a priest in the Church of England. He's a singer-songwriter, quite a gifted musician, and he's a writer and specifically a poet. And this is, I think, one of his more well-known books of poetry that I had the chance to read through recently, and I'm excited to sort of share with you. So I actually have always enjoyed poetry. I read poetry somewhat regularly, but I tend to just dip into books of poetry. And what I do with this channel really is I just review whatever books I read through from cover to cover. So I tend not to give reviews of just little snippets of things, which means I realized I don't really talk about poetry much on this channel because I tend to not read whole books of poetry. But my wife gave this to me last Christmas as a Christmas gift, and I read a few poems from it, and I've referenced it some throughout the year. But as we kind of came into the Christmas season again this month, I thought, I should just sit down and read through this whole book and do a review on it. And so I had the chance to do that, and I'm excited to share this review with you. And as you can see, part of the impetus for that was that this is a set of poems which are designed to go with the church year or the church calendar. So it's not just Christmas poems. It starts there with Advent and Christmas, but it works its way through everything from Christmas through to Easter, in a sense. So I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But Malcolm Guite's book here is has a couple of different pieces to it. It starts off with a really helpful introduction where he kind of walks through what led him to create this book and what this book is. It's something that he envisions individual Christians being able to sort of read and enjoy and use to reflect on those central moments in redemptive history, Christ's incarnation, his ministry, his life, his death, his burial, his resurrection again. Also something that he imagines churches being able to use. Again, he is a priest. He wrote these in part for his local church to use and wants to make that more broadly available as well. So he puts in his introduction kind of an introduction to what it is he's trying to do, trying to use the cycle of the church calendar to provide structure for this cycle of sonnets. And he also talks about what a sonnet is. So if you're not someone who reads a lot of poetry or enjoys poetry, you'll actually find that the sonnet is a very familiar form. Most of Shakespeare's, a lot of Shakespeare's poems are sonnets. It's a form that is very predictable, very structured. He quotes from Dan Patterson, who says a sonnet is a small square poem. You can kind of see they're very digestible. It takes about 60 seconds to read a sonnet. So it's something that is not going to be, this long epic work or this super complex work. It's not a style that a lot of modern poets use, which makes it interesting that Guite, writing here in the 21st century, this book was published in 2012, decided to use the sonnet, which is a form that's hundreds of years old and is often associated with more traditional poetry in his contemporary works. And this is actually one of the things that I love about Malcolm Guite, is that he is undeniably a contemporary modern poet. There will be turns of phrase and references and so forth that, demonstrate he's writing at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st centuries. But he's unafraid to lean on and use some of those older forms. He sees them as being beautiful. He sees them as having resonance. He thinks there's a reason that they were used for hundreds of years. And he's not against modern poetry, but he sort of says in the introduction, like, some modern poets almost seem to take pride in making their poetry difficult and inaccessible. And I definitely found that to be the case as well. And so I like the fact that he's willing to work within the structure of a more traditional form, like the sonnet. And I think these poems are a great example of how you can use a very traditional poetic form to still write in a very fresh and dynamic and contemporary way. So if you are someone who's not only interested in reading poetry, but writing poetry, I think Guite is an interesting kind of conversation partner to help think through what does it mean to be a poet today. And it doesn't have to look like kind of avant-garde, free-form, modern poetry. Not that there's anything wrong with that necessarily. There can be some good examples of that, but in general, I find a lot of these older poets and older poetic forms a lot more helpful and interesting. So I really like, again, the approach that he takes, and what he's doing, like I said, is working through the church calendar. So he starts with actually a series of poems for the four Gospels, one each for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then he works through his own kind of poetic renditions of the great O antiphons. So this is the kind of cycle of poems, which he has in the back as an appendix in the Latin and English versions, which become the basis for the great Christmas hymn, O Come, Emmanuel. And then he works through, again, Advent, and works his way through Easter. He has a cycle of poems within this on the Stations of the Cross, which was really, really beautiful. This is interesting. So with all these other ones, he does one poem per page. When he gets to the Stations of the Cross, he does two things to kind of make this a unit so that you read through it as a whole rather than kind of discrete elements. One is he prints them, two on a page so that you're kind of pulled along by just the formatting and the structure. But the second thing I really love is that within each set, he'll write his sonnet, and then he'll pick one line from this sonnet to start the next sonnet. And that same pattern continues. He'll take the first, one line from the second sonnet, and he'll use that as the first or originating thought for the third sonnet, and on and on and on. It's really interesting to see how he uses that to kind of spark creativity and give some structure to it. And again, it just kind of moves you through the sequence there. These poems are really beautiful, and some of them were, moving me to tears at certain points reading them, just reflecting on Christ's death and his resurrection. And then he works his way through again to Pentecost and so on and so forth. So it's a great cycle of poems. I have thoughts on kind of two levels. So on the one hand, poetically, I find this just to be wonderful. This is a great example of Malcolm Guite's poetry. It's a great example, again, I think, of how to write a contemporary, fresh poem in a very traditional form. And the poems themselves are very imaginative, very creative, will often help you to look at familiar stories and scenes. We're used to thinking as Christians about Christmas and Good Friday and Easter, all these kinds of events, but in new ways. And because they're so short, they give you a lot you can just sort of read and digest and meditate on. So I find it very helpful there. From a pastoral or theological side, on the one hand, I really, really appreciate these poems, partially because what they're really focusing on, it talks about the church calendar, but the heartbeat of this is really biblical stories and biblical events. There's really only one or two, in the Stations of the Cross, there's one kind of apocryphal story about Veronica that gets mentioned, which is not biblical. It was an extra biblical, much later thing that got brought into the Christian tradition. I don't find that helpful. But that was the exception, not the rule. Generally speaking, he's giving poetic meditations on scriptural events, and often soaked and saturated in scriptural and theological language. So I find it to be a set of poems that rings true for me as a Christian and as a Christian pastor, and so I think it's a great resource there. Having said that, while I would highly recommend this as a book of poems, while I would even highly recommend it as something for individual Christians to read, I've been pulling from some of these from my pastoral newsletter just to share with my congregation, so I think they can have use in that way. He has an appendix at the end written by a different priest who argues for incorporating sonnets into into liturgy, into the regular worship service of the church. I'm not convinced of the usefulness of that. Partially because I think God himself has given us the elements within worship. I think the Word of God is what we've come to hear. I think there can be times and places where human poetry comes in. I think that's what many of our hymns are. Perhaps a pastor in preaching or expositing the Word might draw on the language of a poem or something. But in general, I think the worship service is not the place for us to put in our own creations necessarily. So I have hesitancy about that. I also feel the need to say something about just the church year and the use of that. So I'm a minister in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and many of our churches will observe some of what have sometimes been called the evangelical feast days, so Christmas and Good Friday and Easter, perhaps Pentecost or Ascension, things like that. But the emphasis has been kind of twofold. First off, the emphasis has been on recognizing that the church year is not governed by a traditional church calendar that Christians have come up with over time. The spine of the church year is actually the Sabbath day that God himself has given to the church. And I think that's really important, to keep the rhythm of weekly Lord's Day worship, weekly Sunday fellowship as the heartbeat of our church calendar, if you want to kind of use that language. I think that's a good emphasis that comes from within the Reformed tradition. And Malcolm Guite, writing as a more evangelical Anglican, doesn't share that tradition, so I'm not faulting him for not holding to my theology of something, but my theology would impact the way I would use this. I wouldn't sort of use this as a way of structuring the worship of my church overall. I wouldn't be putting these sonnets into the liturgy of the church week to week. But it is, of course, valuable, and even Reformed churches have recognized there's great value in coming back regularly to those central redemptive historical events: Christ's incarnation, Christ's perfect life and ministry, Christ's crucifixion and his death, his burial, his resurrection, his ascension, his pouring out of the Holy Spirit. All of these are biblical themes that Christians should be coming back to again and again. And so I think this is one resource, one kind of devotional tool, as it were, that can help Christians to do that well. So I would highly recommend, if you love poetry, to pick this up. If you're someone who maybe doesn't read a lot of poetry, this is very accessible. It's not esoteric, it's not weird. You'll understand the form. He's using rhyming and clear structures, and each poem takes 1 minute to read. So you could read a poem a day and work your way through this. It's not a big thick book, but it will walk you through those big redemptive historical events with a beautiful, theologically, biblically rich sonnet for each of those things. So just to close then, I'm recording this and posting it right as we come up on Christmas. Christmas is just a couple of days away now. So let me read you one of the sonnets from his Christmastide cycle within this set of sonnets. So this poem is called On the Edge. It's found on page 15. Christmas sets the center on the edge of town, outbuildings of an inn, the fringe of empire, far from privilege and power, on the edge and outer spin of turning worlds, a margin of small stars, that edge a galaxy itself light years from some unguessed-at cosmic origin. Christmas sets the center at the edge, and from this day our world is realigned. A tiny seed unfolding in the womb becomes the source from which we all unfold and flower into being. We are healed, the end begins, the tomb becomes a womb, for now in him all things are realigned. I think that's just a beautiful, again, theologically rich imagining of how Christ's incarnation recenters all of humanity, all of creation, and he becomes the source of life, of new creation, the new heavens, the new earth. His tomb is leading into and becomes, in a sense, the womb from which a new creation is born. So just a great little sample there of Sounding the Seasons by Malcolm Guite.